The philosopher Aquinas believed that it was possible to prove the existence of God. Aquinas thought it was also possible to prove the immortality of the soul. But what about more complex Christian doctrines? Doctrines like the atonement, the substitutionary atonement of Christ for our sins. Can that, in fact, be proved? Can you say anything intelligent about it? What about the Trinity? The Trinity is a very interesting and important Christian doctrine, but it's not a doctrine that appears directly in the Bible. In fact, it's a doctrine that was solidified and articulated at the Council of Nicaea. That's about 325 AD. And yet the Trinity and the atonement are obviously bedrock pillars of Christianity, accepted by Catholics and Protestants alike. Now, there was one medieval thinker, a very important thinker, Peter Abelard, who thought that you could, in fact, provide a rationally coherent account, both of the atonement and of the Trinity. And I want, in subsequent podcasts, to discuss Abelard's ideas on the Trinity, which I'll talk about on Monday, and also his ideas on the atonement, which I will talk about on Tuesday. But I want to introduce Abelard, a very interesting and colorful and controversial character, by talking today just about his life. Now, typically when I talk about Anselm or Aquinas, I don't say a lot about their lives because their lives don't have a lot to do with their ideas, with their work. But this is not the case with Abelard. He kind of got into trouble wherever he was, and his life helps us understand why his fate was so checkered, so up and down, if you will. Now, Abelard was French, and his real name was Pierre, but in English, Peter Abelard. He was born in Brittany to a wealthy family. His father was a knight. But Abelard decided, I'm going to forego, even though I'm the oldest son, I'm going to forego the family inheritance. I'm going to devote my life to scholarship. And he began to study one after the other under some very prominent older scholars and theologians who had a large reputation in Europe at the time. But Abelard soon came to the conclusion that these venerable older men were, in his own words, fools. In other words, Abelard decided they don't really know what they're talking about. I do. And so you've got this young, brash student who is unquestionably brilliant, able, it turns out, to almost humiliate his own teachers in these sessions of discussion and debate. In Abelard's own account, they had to sort of run away with their tail between their legs, so to speak. And so naturally, Abelard, on the one hand, develops a big reputation as sort of the genius in town, but at the same time, he earns the perhaps well-deserved envy and hatred of powerful older men who are well-established in European monasteries and centers of learning. Abelard ends up in Paris, and he takes as a private tutorship a young woman named Heloise. And guess what? He begins a tempestuous affair with Heloise. An affair that actually becomes public. And Abelard allows it to become public. Abelard was apparently a composer of music. He writes Heloise's name into his love songs, and his students start singing them to the tune of musical instruments. So this is a public scandal. And remember, this is a woman who was sort of deputized to Abelard to educate her, and he decides to educate her in other ways. Not long after, Heloise becomes pregnant. And so what does Abelard do? He goes to Heloise's influential uncle, a guy named Fulbert, who is a priest at the Cathedral of Paris. And Abelard offers to marry Heloise secretly. Now, obviously, the uncle is in no way satisfied with this. First of all, he's not into this secret marriage idea. Number two, he knows there's been a public scandal which is hardly vitiated or taken care of by a secret marriage. But nevertheless, Abelard persists. He convinces Heloise to do this secret marriage. And then, in the end, very bizarrely, they have a child together that's basically taken care of by the family, the extended family, and then Abelard convinces Heloise that she needs to enter a convent as a nun. Now, Debbie asked me, she goes, How can you do that? You just had a kid. I don't really know, to be honest. But nevertheless, Heloise agrees to enter a nunnery and become a nun. She does become a nun. But Fulbert, her uncle, when he finds out about this, he thinks that Abelard is basically chucking Heloise aside. He's decided to get rid of her, just sort of send her off to a nunnery. So in rage, this priest brings together his servants and he tells them to go to Abelard's house, and they do, and they capture Abelard and castrate him. Wow. Now, this is the 11th century. Abelard, by the way, was born in 1079, died around 1142. And Abelard, I don't know, if it was today, I try to think of how it would be different. Abelard would say, oh, I'm going to come out as a woman. Thank you, Fulbert, for paying my transition costs. I don't know, but this was the 11th century. So what does Abelard do? He's castrated. Turns out he kind of accepts it. He accepts it as a punishment. Later, he would say that he had two great vices, pride and lechery. And he goes, God took care of both. He goes, he took care of my lechery in a way I would not have selected myself, but by taking away the means to exercise it. And then later, as we'll see, Abelard gets his books burned. In fact, he is forced himself to take his own books, his treasured books, his favorite book, written by him, and put it in the fire. And he goes, that was God's way of teaching me to control my pride. Abelard himself becomes a monk. He joins a monastery. And interestingly, unlike Heloise, who basically became a nun for Abelard's sake, because he told her to, Abelard begins to like being a monk. And he uses his monkhood, if I can use that term, to become a scholar. He writes important work on the resurrection, important works on the atonement. But remarkably, these are the works that get him into major ecclesiastical trouble. So you could almost say that what Abelard does is he takes his personal troubles, his kind of sexual scandals, and he transforms them into intellectual scandals that result in Abelard later in life being condemned by ecclesiastical councils. He's denounced by the Council of Soissons that forced him to burn one of his books. He's later denounced by the Pope, this is Innocent II, who excommunicates Abelard. Abelard would have been completely done for were it not for one of Abelard's influential friends, a guy named Peter the Venerable, who ran an influential monastery named Cluny. And so Peter the Venerable intervenes on Abelard's behalf, says, listen, this guy, he may be brash, he may be proud, but he's a great scholar. Ultimately, the excommunication is lifted. Abelard's sort of Christian status is restored, but Abelard's health begins to deteriorate. He dies, I believe the year is 1142, if memory serves. And that's the end of Peter Abelard. But his writings endure, and we will see starting next time, starting Monday, Tuesday, sorry, we know podcast Monday, holiday. We'll see starting Tuesday the power of Abelard's thought and his ability to take complex doctrines, the resurrection. Who can make sense of it? God is one, God is three, God is one and three at the same time. It's one God, but he's in three distinct persons. And here Abelard takes this seriously and decides, I'm going to make as much sense as reason can deliver about even so complex an idea as the resurrection.